Welcome to one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of South Carolina. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. In the suffocating heat of August 1842, travelers along the dusty roads connecting the rice plantations of the Low Country to the Piedmont region began reporting an impossible sight. A bloodhound, emaciated and limping, moving with unwavering determination through 400 miles of hostile territory. What made this journey remarkable was what plantation records would later reveal. The animal belonged to Samuel, an enslaved field hand who had vanished from the Whitfield estate 3 months prior. The dog's arrival would expose a truth far more disturbing than anyone imagined. The Whitfield plantation stood among the most prosperous estates in Charleston County, its 600 acres of rice fields stretching along the Ashley River, where the water ran dark with tannin and the air hung thick with moisture, and the songs of enslaved laborers working in water up to their knees. Plantation ledgers meticulously maintained by Richard Whitfield documented 73 individuals held in bondage on the property, their names, ages, and skills recorded with the same clinical precision used to catalogue livestock and farming equipment. Among these entries, one name appeared with unusual frequency in the records: Samuel, age 28, whose notations described him as a skilled carpenter and huntsman, a man entrusted with responsibilities that extended far beyond the typical duties assigned to those in his position. Samuel had been granted the rare privilege of training the plantation's hunting dogs, a task that required intelligence, patience, and a degree of autonomy that set him apart from others in the quarters. For 5 years, Samuel had been inseparable from a particular bloodhound named Duke, a massive animal with a rust-colored coat and eyes that seemed to track Samuel's every movement with devoted attention. A letter dated March 1842, written by Overseer James Pritchard to Richard Whitfield, who was traveling on business in Charleston at the time, made specific mention of this bond, noting that Samuel speaks to that hound as one might speak to a brother, and the beast responds with an understanding that borders on the uncanny. The official record of Samuel's disappearance entered the county archives on May 12, 1842, when Sheriff William Crawford filed a report documenting the events of the previous night, noting that the enslaved man known as Samuel had absconded from the Whitfield plantation sometime between the hours of midnight and dawn, taking with him only a canvas sack containing what witnesses later described as basic provisions: dried meat, hardtack, a water flask, and a change of clothing. What struck the sheriff as peculiar, a detail he underlined twice in his careful script, was that Duke, the bloodhound known throughout the county as Samuel's constant shadow, had been found chained in the kennel, whining and pulling at his restraints with such force that the wooden post had begun to splinter, as if the animal understood something terrible had occurred, but could not break free to follow. The mystery deepened considerably when a search of Samuel's quarters, a small cabin he shared with 2 other men behind the main house, revealed a leather folder containing documents that would later be identified as Freedom Papers, nearly complete but lacking only Richard Whitfield's final signature and the county clerk's seal, papers that represented the legal transformation from property to person, from bondage to liberty. The existence of these documents, which Samuel had apparently chosen to leave behind in his flight, raised questions that the sheriff's report did not attempt to answer, though the implications hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. The only contemporaneous account that provides any context for Samuel's sudden departure comes from an unexpected source: a diary belonging to Clara Whitfield, Richard's 17-year-old daughter, discovered nearly a century later in 1923 during an estate sale when a collector purchased a trunk of family papers. Her entry, dated May 10th, 1842, 2 days before Samuel's disappearance, contains a brief but telling observation. She had witnessed her father and Samuel standing near the stables in what she described as a heated discussion, their voices low but urgent, and though she could not make out the words, she noted that Samuel's face held an expression she had never seen before, something between fury and despair. The Charleston Mercury began running advertisements on May 15, 1842, 3 days after Samuel's disappearance, and these notices differed markedly from the typical runaway slave advertisements that filled the back pages of Southern newspapers during that era. The reward offered for Samuel's return stood at $500, a sum that exceeded by several magnitudes the usual bounty for an escaped enslaved person, regardless of their skills or value, and this extraordinary amount immediately attracted attention from professional slave catchers throughout South Carolina and neighboring states. What made the advertisement even more unusual was a specific instruction printed in bold type beneath the physical description of Samuel. The individual was to be returned unharmed, without injury or punishment, and any person who caused harm to Samuel would forfeit the reward entirely and face legal consequences. Letters preserved in the Whitfield family papers, now held in the South Carolina Historical Society archives, reveal the extent of Richard Whitfield's determination to locate Samuel, as he wrote to no fewer than 12 different slave catchers, professional trackers, and bounty hunters across the region, each letter containing the same desperate urgency, the same promise of payment, the same insistence that Samuel must be found quickly and brought back without a single mark upon him. The correspondence suggests a man driven not by anger over lost property, but by something far more complicated, something that his carefully formal language could not quite conceal. While these frantic efforts unfolded across the state, Duke remained chained at the plantation, his situation growing more dire with each passing day. The overseer's daily logs document the animal's decline with clinical precision. May 13th notes that the hound refused all food offered to him. May 15th records that Duke had begun howling through the night, a mournful sound that carried across the fields and kept the other enslaved people awake. And by May 20th, James Pritchard wrote that the dog had worn the fur from his neck, pulling against the chain, his eyes fixed constantly on the road leading away from the plantation, as if watching for someone who would never return. The plantation's daily log for June 3rd, 1842, contains an entry of remarkable brevity, given the significance of what it records, stating simply, in the overseer's efficient hand, "Hound Duke broke chain, animal not recovered, search of immediate grounds yielded no trace." This terse notation suggests a straightforward escape, the natural result of a powerful animal's determination overcoming a metal restraint weakened by weeks of constant strain. But the official record omits details that would emerge only decades later, when historians began piecing together the full story from fragmentary sources scattered across church records and family documents. A testimony recorded in the register of the African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston, given by a woman named Rebecca, who had served as a house servant at the Whitfield plantation, provides crucial context that the overseer's log deliberately excludes. Rebecca's statement, recorded by the church pastor in 1865 after emancipation, when she felt safe enough to speak freely about events from the past, describes how she had discovered the chain on the morning of June 3rd and noticed that several links showed unmistakable signs of having been filed through over the course of multiple nights, the metal worn thin and weakened until a strong pull would snap it completely. The implication embedded in this testimony is clear and deeply troubling. someone on the plantation had deliberately sabotaged Duke's restraints, methodically working over several nights to ensure the animal would eventually break free, though Rebecca's account does not identify who might have performed this act, or why they would have risked severe punishment to do so. Clara Whitfield's diary entry from that same date offers perhaps the most revealing insight into the significance of Duke's disappearance, though her words are characteristically cryptic and incomplete. She wrote that she was present when James Pritchard informed her father about the missing hound, and she noted that Richard Whitfield's face turned the colour of ash, all blood draining from his features as if he had received news of a death, and he said nothing for a long moment before finally whispering words that Clara recorded. He knows what it means. The first documented sighting of Duke after his escape from the Whitfield plantation came from a stagecoach driver named Martin Hendricks, whose sworn statement to authorities in Columbia, South Carolina, dated June 9th, 1842, describes an encounter that would prove to be the beginning of a pattern repeated across the state over the following months. Hendricks stated that while watering his horses at a creek approximately 30 miles north of Charleston, he observed a large bloodhound approach the water on the opposite bank, and even from that distance he could see that the animal was in a deplorable condition, its ribs visible beneath a coat matted with dirt and burrs, its paws leaving bloody prints on the rocks as it walked. The driver attempted to call the dog to him, thinking it lost or abandoned, but the hound drank quickly and then continued northward without acknowledging his presence, moving with what Hendricks described as unnatural determination for an animal in such obvious distress. Over the subsequent weeks, county records and personal testimonies from across South Carolina began accumulating accounts of similar encounters, each one documenting the northward progress of what could only be the same bloodhound, as the descriptions matched too precisely to be coincidental. What made these sightings remarkable was not merely the dog's physical condition, which deteriorated visibly as witnesses tracked its journey through their reports, but rather its behavior, which defied everything people understood about animal nature. Multiple testimonies note that Duke ignored food when it was offered, walking past offerings of meat and scraps without so much as turning his head, showed no interest in other dogs, even when they approached him with either aggression or curiosity, and maintained a trajectory that varied not at all from its northward course, as if following a route mapped with precision. Perhaps the most evocative description comes from the journal of Reverend Thomas Clayton, a Methodist minister in the town of Winnsboro, who recorded on June 18th that he watched the hound pass through the main street at dawn, moving like a creature possessed, or perhaps more accurately, like a creature pulled by an invisible tether toward some distant destination it alone could perceive. The trail of documentary evidence that would eventually illuminate the true nature of Samuel's story lay dormant for nearly half a century, until a discovery in 1891 shifted the investigation from contemporary pursuit to historical inquiry. Thomas Hendricks, a law clerk working in the Circuit Court building in Greenville, South Carolina, found himself assigned the tedious task of cataloging decades of accumulated court documents, papers that had been stored haphazardly in the basement archives where water damage and neglect had rendered many of them illegible or beyond preservation. Among the boxes containing property disputes, debt collections, and criminal proceedings from the antebellum period, Hendricks discovered a sealed packet of letters that had somehow been misfiled among legal documents, the wax seal still intact, though cracked with age, bearing the impression of what appeared to be a family crest. The letters, once carefully opened and examined, proved to be a correspondence spanning 7 years between 1835 and 1842, exchanged between Richard Whitfield of Charleston County and a woman who signed her name as Marguerite Whitfield, writing from an address in Asheville, North Carolina. The contents of these letters, written in the careful formal language characteristic of educated correspondence in that era, made repeated references to a subject identified only as the boy, discussing what they termed our arrangement and the promise made, though the specific nature of both the arrangement and the promise remained frustratingly vague throughout most of the correspondence. The connection between these cryptic references and Samuel, whose name never appeared explicitly in any of the letters, would not become clear until researchers cross-referenced other documents decades later. But even in 1891, Thomas Hendricks recognized that he had stumbled upon something significant. The final letter in the collection, dated April 1842, just 1 month before Samuel's disappearance, contained a passage that Hendricks copied into his personal notes, sensing its importance even without understanding its full context. The letter read, in Marguerite's precise script, "He knows the truth, and I fear what he might do with this knowledge. For a man who discovers he has been denied his birthright may choose any path to claim it." The meticulous work of cross-referencing the discovered letters with existing plantation records, a task undertaken by several researchers over the decades following Thomas Hendricks's initial discovery, gradually assembled a picture of Samuel's origins that explained much about Richard Whitfield's unusual treatment of him and the desperate urgency surrounding his disappearance. Plantation birth records from 1814, maintained in the leather-bound ledger that documented all additions to the Whitfield property, whether through purchase, birth, or inheritance, contain an entry dated November 3rd, noting the birth of a male child to an enslaved woman listed only by her first name, Ruth, who died during the delivery, with no father recorded in the notation, as was typical for children born into bondage. This sparse documentation would have remained unremarkable, just one among hundreds of similar entries recording the expansion of enslaved populations across southern plantations, except that the letters between Richard and Marguerite Whitfield reveal what the official records deliberately obscured. The earliest letters in the collection, those from 1835, when Samuel would have been approximately 21 years old, contain references that become unmistakable once the reader understands their context. Marguerite writes of the boy who carries your features and your burden, and Richard responds with acknowledgement of his son, though never naming him directly. The son born of a relationship that violated every social convention of the era, even as it remained common enough that most plantations harbored similar secrets. Richard Whitfield had been married to his wife, Catherine, for 3 years when Ruth gave birth to Samuel, and the existence of this illegitimate child, the product of his relationship with an enslaved woman he owned, represented a truth that could destroy his social standing, if revealed, yet could not be entirely ignored. The letters document how Richard took what he termed a peculiar interest in Samuel's development, teaching the boy to read in secret sessions held in the plantation office after dark, training him in carpentry and skilled trades that elevated him above field labor, granting him responsibilities and privileges that other enslaved people on the property noted with a mixture of resentment and curiosity. The correspondence between Richard and Marguerite Whitfield contains revelations that transform the narrative from a simple story of escape into something far more tragic, particularly a series of letters from the late 1830s that reference a promise Richard made to Ruth as she lay dying in childbirth, a vow extracted in those final moments when a man might say anything to ease a woman's suffering, but which Richard apparently took with deadly seriousness. According to Marguerite's understanding, conveyed in a letter dated 1837, her brother had sworn to Ruth that their son would not spend his entire life in bondage, that when Samuel reached the age of 30, he would be granted his freedom through proper legal channels and provided with a small parcel of land in North Carolina near Marguerite's own property, where he might live as a free man far enough from Charleston that his connection to the Whitfield name would remain obscure. This arrangement, secret and complex, required years of preparation and the cooperation of Marguerite, who had agreed to help facilitate Samuel's transition to freedom. But the careful plans began to unravel in early 1842, when Richard's legitimate son, Robert Whitfield, returned from extended business dealings in Charleston and somehow discovered the truth about Samuel's parentage through means that remain unclear in the historical record. Robert's own letters to his father, found in the same archive that preserved the correspondence with Marguerite, reveal a young man consumed with rage at what he perceived as an insult to the family honor and his own inheritance. The letters, written in February and March of 1842, grow increasingly demanding and threatening, insisting that Samuel be sold immediately to one of the deep cotton plantations in Mississippi or Alabama, far enough south that he would disappear into the vast machinery of slave labor and never be heard from again. One letter dated March 15th, 1842, contains language so venomous that it clearly indicates the depth of Robert's hatred, stating explicitly, "I will not have a half-blood bastard walking free while bearing our name, even if only he and we know it. And if you proceed with this mad plan, I shall ensure the truth becomes public knowledge that will destroy us all." The final piece of the puzzle that explains Samuel's sudden flight comes from Clara Whitfield's diary, that remarkable document discovered decades after the events it records, which provides an eyewitness account of the confrontation that set everything in motion. Her entry for May 10, 1842, describes how she had been walking through the garden behind the main house in the late afternoon when she heard voices coming from her father's study, the window of which stood open to catch what little breeze moved through the humid air. Clara wrote that she recognized her father's voice immediately, but the second voice took her a moment to identify as Samuel's, speaking with a tone she had never heard him use before. Not the careful deference expected of enslaved people when addressing their master, but something closer to the way one man speaks to another as an equal. She could not make out every word, but she heard enough to understand the devastating message her father was delivering. Richard, his voice thick with what Clara described as either grief or guilt, told Samuel that circumstances had changed, that promises made in good faith could not always be kept when they threatened the welfare of the entire family, and that Samuel would be sold to a plantation in Louisiana within the week. The freedom papers that had been so carefully prepared, that represented years of planning and hope, would be destroyed as if they had never existed. Clara recorded that Samuel's response was silence, a long, terrible silence during which her father apparently tried to explain or justify or apologize, though his words seemed to dissolve into the thick air without effect. When Samuel finally moved, Clara caught a glimpse of him through the window, and she noted that he said nothing, but turned his gaze toward Duke, who lay sleeping by the door, the dog's chest rising and falling in peaceful oblivion. That night, Samuel vanished. Clara's entry concludes with words that suggest she understood far more than anyone knew. Samuel loved that dog more than life. Papa loved Samuel more than he could ever admit. And what happens, she asked, when love collides with the chains we forge? Returning to the chronological tracking of Duke's journey northward through South Carolina, the accumulated testimonies and records create a map of remarkable consistency, documenting the bloodhound's progress through terrain that would have challenged even a healthy animal in peak condition, much less one that witnesses described as increasingly skeletal and injured with each successive sighting. Analysis of the dates and locations suggests that Duke maintained an average pace of 12 to 15 miles per day, moving through cypress swamps where water moccasins coiled on fallen logs, through pine forests where the needle-covered ground left no clear trail, and along roads where any number of dangers might have ended his journey at any moment. The dog's determination manifested not only in his relentless forward movement, but in his willingness to fight when circumstances demanded it, as recorded in the journal of a plantation owner named Augustus Brennan in Spartanburg County, who wrote on June 24th that the hound had passed through his property at dawn, and when Brennan's own hunting dogs, territorial and aggressive, had moved to intercept this intruder, Duke had fought them with what Brennan described as terrible purpose, not the mindless violence of an animal defending itself, but a focused, almost calculated ferocity that drove the other dogs back and allowed him to continue northward without breaking stride. Even more revealing is the account provided by Dr. Edmund Finch, a physician in Union County who treated his own injuries after attempting to capture Duke on July the 2nd, believing the animal might be rabid or dangerous given its condition and behavior. Dr. Finch's medical notes, preserved in his practice records, document lacerations to his hands and forearms, but more significantly, they include his observations about the animal's demeanor during the encounter. The physician noted that the creature showed no aggression until physically restrained, at which point it fought with strength that seemed impossible given its emaciated state. And when their eyes met during the struggle, Dr. Finch wrote that he saw something he could only describe as desperate intelligence, a quality that transcended mere animal instinct and suggested a depth of purpose that left him profoundly unsettled even after the hound had broken free and disappeared into the forest. The narrative timeline shifts forward once more to 1934, when Eleanor Marsh, a graduate student at the University of North Carolina, pursuing research into antebellum transportation routes and infrastructure development, spent months immersed in the state archives in Raleigh, sifting through boxes of personal papers, commercial ledgers, and travel journals that documented the movement of people and goods across the Carolina Territory in the years before the Civil War. Among the materials she examined was a leather-bound diary belonging to a physician and traveler named William Brennan, whose detailed entries chronicled his journey from Virginia through the Carolinas in the summer of 1842, including observations about road conditions, weather patterns, and encounters with various individuals during his travels. The entry dated August 15th, 1842 caught Eleanor's attention immediately, as it described an incident near the North Carolina border that seemed to have affected Dr. Brennan deeply enough that he devoted nearly 2 full pages to recounting it. He wrote that while traveling along a remote stretch of road in the early morning hours, he encountered a bloodhound that appeared to be in the final stages of exhaustion, the animal collapsing onto the packed earth as he approached, its breathing shallow and labored, its body reduced to little more than bones wrapped in torn and bloodied hide. Dr. Brennan, whose medical training extended to veterinary care, as was common for rural physicians of that era, examined the creature and discovered a small leather pouch attached to its collar with a thin strap, the pouch carefully sewn and treated to resist water damage. Inside this pouch, protected from the elements that had battered the dog during its long journey, was a single piece of paper folded into a small square, and when Dr. Brennan opened it, he found written in careful script an address in Asheville, North Carolina, followed by words that would not reveal their full significance until all the other pieces of the story had been assembled. For Samuel, his promised land. The paper bore no other identification except a signature consisting of a single letter, an elegant capital R, written with a hand that suggested both education and emotional turmoil in the way the ink had pressed deep into the paper. Hospital records from Asheville, North Carolina, dated August 23, 1842, contain an admission entry that remained unremarkable in the institution's archives until researchers examining antebellum medical documents in the 1960s recognized its potential connection to the Whitfield case. The entry describes the admission of an adult male, race noted as Negro, estimated age between 25 and 30 years, suffering from injuries that the attending physician catalogued with clinical precision: severe beating resulting in multiple fractures of the ribs and left arm, extensive bruising across the torso and back, lacerations in various stages of healing, and most significantly, a brand mark on the chest described as a recent deliberate burn in the shape of the letter W. No name appears in the hospital record, which was not unusual for enslaved individuals who often entered medical facilities without proper identification. But the notation includes the detail that the patient was brought to the hospital by a woman of middle age, well-dressed and educated in her manner of speech, who paid for his treatment in advance with gold coin and visited daily until his condition stabilized. Property deeds discovered in 1958 during a county records modernization project reveal that Marguerite Whitfield, using the assumed name Margaret Ashton, purchased a small farm of approximately 40 acres outside Asheville in June 1842, 2 months before the hospital admission, paying cash for the property and taking possession immediately. Neighbor accounts preserved in a local history collection compiled in the 1890s describe the woman who lived on that farm as keeping largely to herself, though she was occasionally seen in town purchasing supplies, always accompanied by a man who remained at a distance and a large bloodhound that neighbors noted seemed never to leave the man's side. One particularly detailed account, provided by a neighboring farmer named Jacob Morrison, states that the woman kept to herself with a man and dog, that the man never came to town himself, and that while some said he was her servant, others whispered darker truths about the nature of their relationship and the reasons she had chosen to settle in such an isolated location so far from Charleston society. Medical examiner records from September 1842, housed in the Buncombe County Courthouse, and cross-referenced decades later with burial logs maintained by the small Presbyterian church that served the rural community outside Asheville, reveal the final chapter of Samuel's journey. A man matching his description in every particular, including the distinctive brand mark on his chest and the partially healed fractures documented in the hospital admission records, died on September 7th, 1842, approximately 2 weeks after his release from medical care, the cause of death listed as systemic infection resulting from his injuries, a common outcome in an era before antibiotics, when even minor wounds could turn fatal if bacteria entered the bloodstream. The church burial log notes his interment in an unmarked grave in the small cemetery behind the chapel, a resting place typically reserved for those without family or means to pay for proper monuments. The death certificate itself, a document that remained lost in misfiled county records until its discovery in 1967 by a researcher investigating mortality rates in antebellum North Carolina, contains details that transform our understanding of Samuel's final days. The deceased is identified not as Samuel, property of Richard Whitfield, nor even simply as Samuel with no surname, but rather as Samuel Freeman, the surname carrying profound significance as it represented the legal status he had fought so desperately to achieve. The document bears Marguerite Whitfield's signature as witness to the death, and beneath her careful script appears a notation in her own hand, words that serve as both epitaph and vindication. Died a free man, as promised. Church records and neighbor testimonies indicate that Duke, The bloodhound, who had traversed 400 miles to complete the journey his master could barely finish, never left the gravesite after Samuel's burial, lying on the freshly turned earth and refusing all attempts to move him or provide him with food and water. The animal died 3 days later, on September 10th, and Marguerite, honoring the bond that had driven this remarkable journey, arranged for Duke to be buried in the plot beside Samuel. 2 graves side by side in the red Carolina clay, united in death as they had been inseparable in life. The triangulation of evidence from letters, testimonies, medical records, and witness accounts allows historians to reconstruct what actually transpired during those desperate weeks in the summer of 1842, revealing a tragedy shaped by conflicting loyalties and the brutal machinery of a system that reduced human relationships to questions of property and inheritance. After Samuel disappeared on the night of May 10th, Richard Whitfield did not simply post reward notices and wait, but rather sent an urgent message to his sister Marguerite through a trusted courier, informing her that Samuel was attempting to reach North Carolina and instructing her to shelter him when he arrived, as Richard would work to arrange proper freedom papers through legal channels in a different jurisdiction where Robert's influence could not interfere. However, Robert Whitfield, suspicious of his father's behavior and determined to prevent what he viewed as a catastrophic betrayal of family and social order, discovered the plan through means that remain unclear, but likely involved intercepting correspondence or questioning servants. Robert immediately hired a group of professional slave catchers, providing them with Samuel's description and likely route, offering payment not for capture and return, but for permanent removal of the problem his half-brother represented. These men tracked Samuel with ruthless efficiency, catching him on a remote road approximately 50 miles south of Asheville, after he had traveled nearly 350 miles from Charleston, so close to his destination that he must have believed safety was finally within reach. The slave catchers beat him with terrible severity, the violence serving both as punishment for running and as a warning to others who might consider similar defiance, and they began transporting him back toward South Carolina in chains. Samuel, driven by desperation, or perhaps by the knowledge that return meant certain sale and permanent separation from any hope of freedom, managed to escape during the night while his captors slept, though his injuries were by then so severe that the escape itself became a form of slow death. He reached Marguerite's farm more dead than alive, and Duke arrived weeks later, having followed either scent or some deeper instinct connected to the address Richard had sewn into his collar, completing the journey Samuel could barely finish. The final assembly of documentary evidence spans decades and reveals how the participants in this tragedy lived with its aftermath, beginning with a letter Richard Whitfield wrote to his sister in October 1842, 2 months after Samuel's death, a letter that Marguerite preserved among her most private papers and which was discovered after her own death. Richard's words convey a grief that official correspondence could never capture, writing that he had failed in the one promise that mattered most, that he could not save his son from the world they had built together, this world that makes fathers enslave sons and brothers hunt brothers, and that he would carry this failure to his own grave. Richard died in 1847, and his estate passed to Robert, whose own will dated 1869 reveals that he lived to see the collapse of everything the Whitfield name had represented, dying wealthy from investments made before the war, but childless and alone, the plantation itself sold during Reconstruction to pay debts and taxes, the great house eventually falling to ruin among fields that returned to forest. In 1972, a local historical society in Asheville proposed placing a marker at the cemetery where Samuel and Duke were buried, but the application was rejected by the State Historical Commission due to what they termed insufficient documentation of the individual's historical significance, a decision that reflected how thoroughly such stories had been erased from official memory. Perhaps the most powerful piece of evidence is a photograph taken in 1894, discovered in a collection of regional historical images, showing an elderly woman placing flowers on 2 graves beneath a willow tree. The woman identified in notations on the photograph's reverse as Marguerite Whitfield, age 82. The headstone visible in the image, modest but carefully maintained, reads simply, "Samuel and Duke, 1842, together at last." Cemetery records indicate that Marguerite continued this ritual every month until her death in 1896, at which time the cemetery register notes, per her explicit written request submitted years earlier, she was buried in the plot directly beside them, 3 graves in a row beneath that willow tree, a woman who kept faith with promises that others had broken, watching over a man and dog who had traveled impossible distances in search of freedom.